Hi, Carol, and thanks so much for providing me with all the information I needed in order to make some informed recommendations on your behalf. Today, I want to take a couple moments to go over some of the specific asks you had of me. Specifically, two things. I want to talk about some of the short-term spending needs, specifically the dental procedure for Kirby, as well as the educational needs for Sarah. And secondly, I want to talk about the tax ramifications of possibly selling your primary home. So going back to the short-term spending needs, one of the questions you asked me was, would you like to that you wanted me to review the idea of selling stock A in order to fund Kirby's dental procedure. And the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of cost basis. So you currently you inherited that stock after it had been purchased for an original investment amount of $4,000. Now that stock was owned by Jason, your deceased husband, and it passed to you. Upon passing to you, the cost basis was actually stepped up. And when I say cost basis, what I'm talking about is the amount that your cost for the stock. So, although no proceeds were added by you, at the passing of Jason, when that stock was transferred to you, you enjoyed what we call a stepped up basis. So essentially, your cost in the stock or your interest in the stock was stepped up to whatever the price was on that day. And the market value on that day, I believe the stock was then valued at $13,000. So cost basis essentially is a benchmark for um, when you have to start paying taxes on it. So for instance, your cost basis is currently $13,000 after being stepped up after you received it as a result of Jason's passing. So anything above that mark, you would actually be responsible for taxes on. Now, it is a long term gain, which has more favorable tax rates than if you had only owned or Jason had only owned the stock for a year. So not only his cost basis carries over, but his holding period as well. So the stock is currently valued at $15,000. So given that you have an interest in the stock of $13,000, the difference being 2,000, you'd be responsible if you liquidated that stock for any taxes on any long-term gains on the $2,000 difference. Now, while that may not be a huge amount of money, it does suggest that we should look at some alternatives to funding that process or funding that procedure that don't necessarily incur taxation. So doing a review of your overall portfolio, it looks like you have some substantial cash in your checking and savings account. The checking account, I believe, is currently growing at a rate of 1%. The stock is actually growing at an annual rate of 9.5%. So that's a considerable growth rate that can help fund future costs of whatever needs you may have in the future. So my recommendation is to use the cash that you currently have on hand in order to fund the procedure, which actually takes me to the next point. Um, Kirby's a minor, so you can't necessarily give him a gift. There are methods to give him a gift. There are actually they're very limited options. One being a UGMA, which is essentially a custodial account for the behalf of Kirby, um, that would require you to transfer the stock into that account, and then the custodian would be able to um, use those proceeds in order to fund that orthodontic procedure. Now, that would subject Kirby to what we call a kiddie tax. While it's less than an adult rate tax, it is a tax that can be avoided. So, in addition, there's like 529s, which are essentially for educational costs, and then there's a trust. But all those things require a lot of administration. And there are simpler ways to do it and more tax efficient ways of doing it. So Given that Kirby's getting an orthodontic procedure done, if you were to actually pay the dentist directly, you would be able to avoid any taxation and avoid some of the administration that would be required in order to fund the process via the limited methods in which you could transfer a gift to a minor. And when I talk about gift, there's one thing that needs to be taken in consideration. Gifts in excess of $14,000 actually are liable for or there's a tax liability associated with any gift above $14,000. The IRS does give an exclusionary amount of $14,000 that you can make to anyone that's an adult, a gift to anyone that's an adult. And now, the appreciated stock happens to be worth $15,000 as of today. So even so, a couple of things. So even if you were to sell that stock and pay for his or give him the money to pay for that procedure, if he was an adult, you would still incur costs because, as we talked about, the current market price is above the cost basis. So the way to avoid taxation and some of the administration and still be able to satisfy the needs of Kirby and not take an appreciable asset out of or take away the ability for that asset to continue to appreciate at a pretty favorable rate is to just go ahead and use some of that cash on hand and pay it directly to the dentist. That's called a qualified transfer, and that qualified transfer is not subject to any gift tax at all. And a similar situation is with Sarah and your desire to fund her first year of college. Now, a couple of things. Now, Sarah's an 18-year-old, so she's an adult. You could literally give her $20,000, but again, that's in excess of $14,000, and either you or Sarah would be responsible for a gift tax on the difference between the $14,000 and the $20,000. There are some alternatives. You could give Sarah the gift over 2 years, right? So the first semester would begin in September. She could essentially be given a gift of $10,000 in August to fund her first semester, and again, a gift could be given to her in January to fund the second semester. But again, that requires a bit more administration. And again, when transferring money or a gift directly to a, um, a college or an academic institution, that's also a qualified gift as well. So, in both scenarios, you have the opportunity to pay directly to the institutions as well as continue to allow those appreciable assets to grow. So, the second thing I want to talk about is the idea that you presented to me of potentially selling your primary residence. So, your primary residence was bought many years ago and at an amount of $110,000. It's currently valued at $400,000. That's been a considerable growth over the years of $290,000. Now, um, your concern was taxation. Fortunately, the IRS favors married couples essentially. So there's actually a an allowance that the government states that allows you to um, it, that allows you to realize a gain from the sale of a residence, and if you're married, that's $500,000 that they will not recognize as income, and you will not be responsible for paying taxes on. Now, the idea that Jason has passed, that does bring into question how much of a gain you will have on that home. It just so happens that at within 2 years of the anniversary of Jason's passing, if you sell the home, and when I say 2 years, I mean 2 years to the day of it's like an anniversary, 2 years to the date that he passed. If you sell the home within that time frame, you still get to enjoy the privileges just as if you're still filing married joint tenants with rights of survivorship. So, um, you're able to go ahead and ensure that none of that $290,000 will be looked at by the IRS as a gain. So you could essentially sell your home, not have to worry about taxation in this case, as long as you do it within the 2 years from the date of Jason's passing. So they're my two suggestions, and I'd be happy to hear your questions at this point.